He may be crazy, but at least he still has his sense of humor, I thought to myself. As I walked to my truck, I began considering my next move. By the time I climbed behind the wheel, I had hatched a tentative plan, and despite having no idea of what was going to happen, I knew I had to see it through. In for a penny, in for a pound. That's how these things work. I first stopped home and told my wife that I was going to keep an eye on the store during the storm. I am never comfortable on those rare occasions when I tell a little lie to my wife, and this time was no exception. After gathering some extra wet weather gear and doing a last-minute inspection around the house, I hastily left, hoping that my ruse had avoided detection. As I drove in the direction of Bolton Beach, I too began to feel a sense of excitement welling up inside me. Whatever was going to happen, it certainly promised to be interesting, I thought to myself with a nervous laugh. As I pulled into the parking lot at Bolton Beach, I could clearly see that the storm was at hand. Like two worlds colliding, the sunny, pleasant world of 5 minutes ago was being swallowed whole by the black wall cloud racing in from the ocean. The transition was so sudden, my eyes barely had enough time to adjust to the loss of light. I jumped out of my truck, popped open the back, and put my waders and dry top on, and snugged up the hood over my head. As I finished suiting up, I couldn't help but notice how warm it had become. It felt like the devil himself was breathing all over the beach. I made my way to the top of the long stairs leading down to the beach and quickly scanned the shore looking for Terry. He was there, slightly west of the landing, standing at the water's edge. As I began the long descent down the stairs, I heard the town clock toll 1 bell. That would be 2:30, I thought to myself, so whatever is going to happen, I hope it happens soon. Upon reaching the beach below, I began walking slowly toward where Terry was standing, unsure of what I would do, or say for that matter, when I arrived. When I was near, I walked to the water's edge and approached him from the side, so as not to startle him, even though I suspected he knew my exact whereabouts from the moment I pulled into the parking lot. I stopped when I was about 10 feet away. Amidst a gathering squall, he stood there silently, head cocked in deep concentration, looking as though he was tuned into some alien radio signal that only he could hear. I stood and waited for him to acknowledge my presence. And I waited. After maybe 10 minutes, I began to think that maybe I had made a mistake and should leave. As if plucking my thoughts out of thin air, he stirred from his meditative state and turned his head in my direction. "Thank you for coming," he intoned. And then just as quickly, he again looked to the horizon and returned to his silent vigil. Well, at least he knows I'm here, I thought to myself as I mentally settled in to wait for whatever was to come. Despite the amazing speed with which the storm came ashore, the wind was not overbearing yet, nor was it raining much. Also, with the new moon a week away and the outgoing tide, there didn't appear to be much storm surge. I couldn't help thinking that the water looked very fishable, clean and green with lots of white water. As I waited with Terry, I watched the numerous herring gulls working the surf line, floating gracefully on the wind currents before diving down to pick a piece of hapless bait from the churning water below. Their calculated and controlled movements were in direct contrast to the chaos of the strengthening storm, and their endless feeding forays provided a pleasant distraction. Over the wind, the familiar notes of the Westminster chime rang out from the town clock, followed by the tolling of 3 bells. The afternoon was wearing thin. Over the next half hour, the storm continued to build. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was very impressive. Standing on the shore during any storm of this magnitude would never be my first choice, but I had to admit that it was a very exhilarating experience. It wasn't raining much, but the wind had picked up considerably and was pushing a pretty good heave in its wake. And all the while Terry never moved, like a military man at attention, rod at his side, eyes forward. Right about the time my ears picked up the toll of a single bell from the town clock, my eyes picked up a band of light-colored sky just above the horizon. The eye of the storm was fast approaching. As the sound of the bell faded in the wind, Terry sprang to life. Without saying anything, he strode out into the wash, rod in hand. As he walked, he unhooked the huge plug he had tied on earlier from its resting place on one of the rod eyes and reeled in the slack. When he was thigh-deep in the rushing white water, he stopped and the wading began again. From the shore where I stood, he seemed to be actively looking for something, scanning the water for some sign that only he could recognize. After a few minutes, he apparently saw what he was looking for. He quickly strode forward several paces and laid into a long cast. The plug sailed outward into the teeth of the wind, landing just beyond the first wave. Terry stepped back a few paces and quickly reeled in the slack. As the plug dug deep into the back of the wave, he slowed his retrieve and raised his rod tip, letting the plug wallow in the backsuck of the now breaking wave. He didn't have to wait long. He set back hard, and the bend in his rod told the story, as it was clearly being stressed in a manner that it had never been designed for. This was a big fish, actually a huge fish. What was surprising to me was that Terry wasn't playing this fish at all. It looked as though he was literally trying to drag it across the top of the water. There was a sense of desperation in the way he fought this fish that reminded me of a drowning man trying to pull himself out of a well. I feared he had little chance of landing her if he continued his present course of action. But as much as Terry was a large and powerful individual, the fish on the other end of the line was equal to the task. She was reluctant to move and only gave ground grudgingly, straining Terry's rod to the breaking point. But give ground she did, as Terry pumped her steadily closer, leaning with all his might. Before very long, he had her within range, still very green and beating the wash to a frenzy, about 30 feet away. But she hadn't played her trump card yet. Taking advantage of a receding wave, she bolted toward the deeper water beyond the break line in a determined bid for freedom. As Terry thumbed the spool and leaned back to turn her head toward shore, a resounding crack signaled that his rod had finally given up the ghost and had snapped just below the gathering guide. Without a moment's hesitation, he grabbed the cracked upper section of the rod with his right hand and discarded the butt section and the reel. He quickly worked his way up to the rod tip and wrapped the line around his left hand. The upper rod section joined the butt and reel on the sea floor. Terry was now down to landing this fish with what amounted to nothing more than a hand line. The loss of his rod and reel did nothing to deter Terry's intense focus, and in a single-minded act of will, he began dragging the monstrous fish toward him. Hand over hand, 1 foot at a time, the fish grew closer to where Terry stood. White water exploded everywhere around her as she desperately fought to free herself, but her efforts were in vain. Within moments, Terry had the huge fish at his feet, thrashing wildly in the wash. He reached down with his left hand, wrapped the line around it, and pulled her head up out of the water. Then, with blinding speed, he clamped his right hand onto her lower jaw, popped the front treble hook out with his left, and tossed the plug aside into the wash. His left hand joined his right on her jaw just in time, as the sting of the hook being removed set her off. Like two behemoths locked in hand-to-hand combat, the battle raged, but for the huge fish there would be no escaping Terry's vice-like grip. He had her now, and he wasn't letting go. With the fish firmly in his grasp, Terry dropped to his knees. The wash was now up to his chest, and he was taking on water. As the huge fish struggled, he drew her huge head to within inches of his face and stared directly into her eyes. Her struggles increased as if to avoid his gaze, but he held her fast, imposing his will upon her. Seemingly sensing the futility of further resistance, her struggling ceased, and she became motionless and supple in Terry's grip. Joined in some strange ritual, they held this position for several minutes, silent and unmoving, as the storm raged around them and the eye wall drew near. Then, as if some secret accord had been reached, the giant fish shook her head, and Terry released his grip. Her huge head sank below the seething waters, and with a slap of her tail she bolted out to sea. For the next couple minutes Terry remained motionless, as if in a trance, completely heedless of his surroundings. During that time, the Westminster chimes could be heard emanating from the town clock, followed by the tolling of 4 bells. As the 4th bell tolled, he rose very slowly and turned to face the sea and the imminent arrival of the eye of the storm. Just as he had the first day I ever saw him, he once again raised both arms high over his head, looked skyward, and began singing. Over the sound of wind and waves, his voice rang out strong and clear, as if summoning the heavens to take notice. The song was short, simple, and beautiful, and as it repeated over and over, I became aware that it no longer sounded like it was just Terry singing. To my ear, it sounded like many voices had joined in and were singing in unison. I suddenly felt every hair on my body stand up. Even the hair on my head was moving away from my scalp. What? The bolt of lightning that dropped out of the sky couldn't have missed us by more than 50 feet, and the resulting crack of thunder was so loud it stunned the senses. As it rolled off in the distance, I realized that the singing had stopped, and as I looked over at Terry, I saw that he was completely enveloped in the blue plasma glow of St. Elmo's fire. He turned and faced me, and then raised his arm up to his line of sight, calmly examining the blue aura that surrounded him. As he dropped his arm back down, the plasma evaporated into thin air with a snap. The eye of the storm was now directly overhead, and through the hole in the clouds, the sun shone down brightly and the winds abated. Terry walked over to where I stood, and despite looking like a large drowned rat, it was apparent that a very profound change had taken place in him. His face looked somehow younger, more at peace. "Too much spooky stuff for you?" he said, the sparkle in his eye saying that he still possessed his sense of humor. I just shook my head and smiled. "Never a dull moment when you're around, that's a fact," I said. He laughed as we headed toward the stairs. Halfway there he stopped, and as I looked up, he pointed west down the beach. "I go this way, remember?" he asked, smiling. "Oh yeah, I forgot," I said. "Let me give you a lift back. You're soaking wet." He held up his hand to halt any further insistence. "Thank you," he said, "but it is my journey, and I must finish it on my own." There was a sense of closure in his voice. "So what now?" I asked. "Now," he said, "now I go home." "Yeah, you need to get out of those wet clothes or you'll catch your death," I added. A sad smile creased his face. He stood there looking at me as if trying to figure out what to say next. "I have something for you," he said solemnly. He reached down behind his neck. After a moment, he pulled a small amulet from around his neck and stood looking at it dangling from his hand for several seconds. "The sea has many faces, but no heart," he said. "Wear this, and you will always find your way back to safe ground." With that, he extended his arm out, offering the amulet to me. "Geez, Terry, I don't know what to say," I said. "You do not have to say anything, as it is my wish that you should have it." I took the amulet from his outstretched hand and held it up to my line of sight. In the late afternoon light, it looked like a piece of smooth brown rock, or possibly bone, hanging from a soft, thin animal hide cord. Surprisingly, it felt as light as a feather. "You should put it on now," he said, smiling. "I wouldn't want you to lose it." I complied with his wish, struggling some to get it down inside my clothing. Once settled around my neck, I realized I could no longer feel it against my body. "That's odd," I said. "I can't even feel it." In answer to my surprised look on his face, Terry just smiled and nodded his head as if expecting this very reaction. "Thank you," I said. "No, it is I who thank you," he replied as he bowed his head slightly. Now I was completely confused. "Me? What did I do?" I asked. The same sad smile I had seen a minute earlier returned to his face. He stood there looking at me as if trying to paint some mental picture of the moment in his head for future posterity. "You wouldn't understand," he said, and with a wink of his eye he turned and headed down the beach. Little did I know that those would be the last words I ever heard from Terry. I stood there for a short time watching his huge form grow ever smaller in the distance while I silently reflected on the strange events of the day. I finally turned and made my way off the beach and back to my truck. As I shed my wet weather gear, I began to wonder if my wife had caught wise to my lie. I mentally crossed my fingers, hoping that she hadn't, because trying to explain this would not be an easy task. As I climbed into my truck, the sun was shining and the air was warm and humid. Considering that it was late October, it felt just like a summer day. Strange days indeed. The backside of the storm never materialized, apparently blowing itself out over the Atlantic. Locally, there was no real damage reported, other than a few loose shingles blown around, and by the next day it was back to business as usual. Thankfully, it appeared that my wife had not discovered my little secret, and if she had, she never made mention of it. The next morning, after a remarkably sound night's sleep, I arose early and attended to the store windows, getting all the boards down and stowed away by the time we opened at 9 a.m. When my wife relieved me from my shift at 1 p.m., I shot straight away for the Old Coast Road and headed for Terry's camper. As I pulled into the empty lot, the realization that he was gone caught me sideways. Apparently, I had completely failed to grasp the meaning of what he had said the day before about him going home. I got out of my truck and walked around the lot for a bit. Turning toward the sea, I looked out over the vista that Terry must have viewed many times during his stay here. I stood there for a very long time, working through a series of conflicting emotions. On the one hand, I was happy for him, that he was going back to his true home to be with his people. On the other hand, I was sad, as our little town, and my life in particular, would be a little less exciting in his absence. After a time, I got in my truck and drove home. Nowadays, when I look back on those long ago events, I like to think that Terry had found whatever it was that he had been searching for. I also like to think that he had returned to his people and had taken up his rightful position as spiritual leader of his tribe. And I think this may not be far from the truth. Several weeks back, I received a curious package in the mail. It arrived at the store and was addressed to my attention and had no return address. When I opened it, there were only 2 items inside: a big old hand-carved plug with monster hooks and a single eagle's feather. I haven't stopped smiling for weeks. I've never really come to grips with what happened during those final days before he left. That night around the campfire, Terry said I'd been shown favor and that it was a great honor. At the time, I didn't understand what he was talking about, but I think I do now. For the record, I'm not saying that I buy into all this Indian hocus-pocus, but ever since that night, my back has never bothered me again. My cholesterol numbers are spot on despite my lifelong love affair with junk food, and I have the blood pressure of an 18-year-old. Terry called it a rare gift. My doctor calls it a miracle. As to why I was bestowed this honor, I will never really know. Perhaps it was simply because I befriended a man who badly needed a friend. As for the amulet that Terry gave me that afternoon after the storm, well, whenever my wife asks me why I won't take that ratty thing off from around my neck, I just tell her, "You wouldn't understand."